Hey everybody, this video is called Further Construction, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study in the book of 1 Kings. We're going to look at Solomon now building his own palace. So Solomon had just built the house of the Lord, and now he's building his own, and we're going to see the description behind it. So 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 1 starts out, "But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house." So, as I mentioned already, after building the house of the Lord, Solomon is building one for himself at this point. And it's a complex structure that took almost twice as long as building the temple, because we know the temple took 7 years, and the house for him, it took 13 years. And the time involved probably was because there wasn't the same preparation for building or urgency as it was for the national place of worship. And this temple and Solomon's house together, when you add them together, took 20 years to complete, as you're also going to find in a couple chapters from now. And in the last video, in verse 38 on Friday, it stated that the temple took 7 years. So like I said, you add 7 and 13, you get 20. But to drive on here, verse 2 through 12, "He also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, with 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. And it was paneled with cedar above the beams, that it were 45 pillars, 15 to a row. There were windows with beveled frames in 3 rows, and windows was opposite window in 3 tiers. And all the doorposts and the doorways had rectangular frames, and the window was opposite window in 3 tiers. He also made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its width 30 cubits. And in front of them was the portico of pillars, and a canopy that was in front of them. And then he made a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment, where he might judge, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall, of like workmanship. And Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. All these were of costly stones, cut to size, trimmed with saws inside and out, and from the foundation to the eaves, and also on the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, large stones, some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. And above were costly stones, hewn to size, and cedar wood. The great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stones, and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner court of the house of the Lord, and the vestibule of the temple." So as part of the palace complex, Solomon built a large rectangular building where we see the measurements 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. And he called this thing the house of the forest of Lebanon. And we see 3 rows of cedar columns, supported, trimmed cedar beams, and a cedar roof. And the halls of pillars was probably an entry hall or a waiting area for the hall of judgment, and which was probably used in the transaction of public business. And the hall of judgment was where Solomon would publicly hear petitions brought by the Israelites, and he would make a judgment in those cases. And it was added to the grand palace site. And behind this hall of justice was an open court. And within this court, Solomon built his own personal residence, a palace for his harem and royal apartments. And we see that he built for the Egyptian princess daughter, that he didn't marry the daughter, but he married the Egyptian princess. He built for her daughter. And a fortune was spent on building adjacent to the temple. And the whole palace had 3 parts. It had the king's home, it had the courtyard in the middle, and the house of the woman on the other side. And later, when we go into chapter 10 next week, verse 16 and 17, it mentions 500 gold shields were hung in the forest, in the house of the forest of Lebanon. And later on in Isaiah the prophet later called the house of the forest an armory in Isaiah 22 verse 8. In Solomon, he made his palace more spectacular than the temple. And I could almost hear him, bragging like Trump would, I can build this better than anybody else. But Haggai spoke powerfully to those who think more about their house than the house of God in the book of Haggai, chapter 1, verse 3 through 10. And as we're going to see, Solomon gets caught up in his own selfishness. In verse 13 to 14, now King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of the widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man from Tyre, a bronze worker. He was filled with wisdom and understanding, and skill in working with all kinds of bronze work. So he came to the king, Solomon, and did all his work. So these verses in 13 and 14, it's not speaking about the king of Tyre, but a different Hiram, whose mother was of the tribe of Naphtali. In 2 Chronicles account, chapter 2, verse 14, states that his mother came from the tribe of Dan. And the two differences likely refer to one being her place of birth and the other one being her place of residence. And the description of Hiram's skills is exactly the same as such as Bezalel, who made the tabernacle in Exodus 31 verse 3 and Exodus 36 verse 1. And as we're going to see in the upcoming verses, Hiram made the pillars. In verses 15 through 51, we're going to read a huge chunk here, and it might actually be the remaining of this chapter here. So we're just going to knock the bronze pillars for the temple out, the description here. It says, and he cast 2 pillars of bronze, each one 18 cubits high, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of each. Then he made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. He made a lattice network with wreaths of chainwork for the capitals, which were on top of the pillars, 7 chains for one capital and 7 for the other capital. So he made the pillars and 2 rows of pomegranates above the network all around to cover the capitals that were on top. And thus he did for the other capital. The capitals which were on top of the pillars in the hall were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits. The capitals on the 2 pillars also had pomegranates above, by the convex surface which was next to the network, and there were 200 such pomegranates in rows on each of the capitals all around. Then he set up the pillars by the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar, and he set up the pillar on the left and called its name Boaz. The tops of the pillars were in the shapes of lilies, so the work of the pillars was finished. And then we see it moves into the sea and the oxen. And he made the sea of cast bronze, 10 cubits from one brim to the other. It was completely round. Its height was 5 cubits, and line was 30 cubits measured by its circumference. Below its brim were ornamental buds, encircling it all around, 10 to a cubit, all the way around the sea. The ornamental buds were cast into 2 rows. When it was cast, it stood on 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, 3 looking toward the west, 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. The sea was set upon them, and all their back parts pointed inward. It was handbreadth thick, and its brim was shaped like a brim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It contained 2,000 baths. And we see the description for the cart and the lavers. He also made 10 carts of bronze. 4 cubits was the length of each cart, 4 cubits its width, and 3 cubits its height. And this was the design of the carts. They had panels, and the panels were between frames. On the panels that were between the frames were lion, oxen, and cherubim, and on the frames was a pedestal on top. Below the lions and oxen were wreaths of plated work. Every cart had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and its 4 feet had supports. Under the laver were supports of cast bronze beside each wreath. Its opening inside the crown at the top was 1 cubit in diameter, and the opening was round, shaped like a pedestal. 1.5 cubits in outside diameter, and also on the opening were engravings, but the panels were square, not round. Under the panels, the 4 wheels and the axles of the wheels were joined to the cart. The height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The workmanship of the wheels was like the workmanship of a chariot wheel. Their axle pins, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast bronze. And there were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each cart. Its supports were part of the cart itself. On the top of the cart, at the height of 0.5 cubit, it was perfectly round. And on the top of the cart, its flanges and its panels were of the same casting. On the plates of its flanges and on its panels, he engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees, whenever there was a clear space on each, with wreaths all around. Thus he made the 10 carts. All of them were of the same mode, 1 measure, 1 shape. Then he made 10 lavers of bronze. Each laver contained 40 baths, and each laver was 4 cubits. On each of the 10 carts was a laver, and he put 5 carts on the right side of the house, and 5 on the left side of the house. He set the seat on the right side of the house, toward the southeast. Hiram made the lavers and the shovels and the bowls. So it moves into the furnishings of the temple here. So Hiram finished doing all the work that he was able to do for King Solomon for the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals were on top of the 2 pillars, the 2 networks covering the 2 bowl-shaped capitals, which were on top of the pillars. 400 pomegranates for the 2 networks, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network to cover the 2 bowl-shaped capitals that were on top of the pillars. The 10 carts, the 10 lavers on the carts, 1 sea and 12 oxen under the sea, the pots, the shovels, and the bowls. All these articles which Hiram made for King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze. In the plain of Jordan, the king had them cast in clay molds between Succoth and Zertan. And Solomon did not weigh all the articles because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Thus Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, and the table of gold, which was the showbread, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left side, in front of the inner sanctuary, with the flowers and lamps and the wick trimmers of gold, the basins, the trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, and the censers of pure gold, and the hinges of gold, both for the doors of the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors of the main hall of the temple. So the work of King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings. He put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So, very descriptive passage. A lot of expository preachers, when they go through this part of the Bible, they push, a couple chapters in their sermons. But I go chapter by chapter for the most part. And so verses 15 through 51, some of the details we get is one bronze pillar was on each side of the temple's entrance. And each pillar, we see the measurement was 27 feet high, 18 feet around the capitals. And it was treated, the upper ends of the bronze pillars, you added 7.5 feet to the height of each pillar. And pomegranates, they were one of the fruits of the promised land in Numbers chapter 13, verse 23. And I'm just going to make a note. I'm glad I didn't go through the promised land because I don't like pomegranates. But they were popular decorative patterns used on the hem of Aaron's priestly garment in Exodus 28, verse 33 through 34. And Javan in Boaz recalls the promises given to the Davidic house and were symbolic of the strength and stability of God's promise of a kingdom forever, even though the temple would come down, as seen later on in Jeremiah 52, verse 17. And the sea here, we must realize, is not speaking about the ocean, but a huge circular bronze basin corresponding to the laver of the tabernacle. And according to verse 26, this great basin capacity held about 12,000 gallons. And the sea stood in the courtyard on the temple's southeast side, and it provided the priests water to have personal hygienes to wash themselves in their sacrifices, as you find later in the account in 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 6. And it also supplied water for the 10 movable basins. And Hiram arranged 3 oxen facing in each of the 4 directions of the compass to support the sea. And Humar made 10 bronze basins as water containers for the stands, and the measurements of those were 6 feet across, and it held 240 gallons of water. And we see that he made 10 movable stands of bronze, 6 foot square and 4.5 feet high. And each consisted of 4 upright corner poles joined together by square panels. And for mobility, the stands rode on the 4 wheels of bronze. And shovels were used to scoop up the ashes that were emptied into the bowls for disposal. And the same tools served the same purpose in the tabernacle as seen in Exodus 27, verse 3. In verse 45, bronze polished to a high shine. And Sukkoth was on the east side of the Jordan River, just north of the Jabbok River, and Zertin was nearby. And the location was good for metallurgy because it abounded in clay suitable for molds and lay close to a source of charcoal for heat, and namely the forests across the Jordan. And the altar of incense stood in front of the most holy place, as you find back with the tabernacle in Exodus 30, verse 1 through 4. And the table was made on which the showbread was placed, which the law required to be continually in God's presence, as stated in Exodus 25, verse 30. And you might recall the description of the 10 golden lampstands that were directly in front of the most holy place, 5 on either side of the doors, and it provided a corridor of light. And Solomon, he deposited that which David had dedicated to the Lord back in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7 through 12, in the side rooms of the temple. And we're going to wrap up at this point, but we looked at Solomon's building his house. We see the witness of Solomon's palace, the splendor of it, and we were introduced to the half-Israelite and the best craftsman around Hiram. And we saw that Hiram make the needed furnishings for the temple basically after the same pattern of the tabernacle furnishings. And that's going to wrap up this video today. We're keeping this short because, like I said, these sections might not be able to hold your attention long. And many people, they skim through it even quicker than this. But we're 1/3 of the way through our study in 1 Kings. We still have another quite a few, like 5 weeks or whatever to go. And we'll see you next as we'll look at the dedication of the temple. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and we'll see you then.